Cyberpunk 2077 has been in development for what seems like an eternity. After being first revealed in 2012 and pushed back multiple times, the game slowly started becoming a myth, or a meme. And of course, as with any piece of entertainment, the longer the wait, the higher the expectations will be. What also greatly contributed to the game's hype is the fact that it's developed by CD Projekt Red, the studio behind the acclaimed Witcher series. But obviously, it would be absurd not to acknowledge the crazy amount of promotional material released. On the gameplay side of things, they preferred few but long gameplay sequences, but as for everything else, their marketing strategy was super aggressive. They released numerous behind-the-scenes and trailers highlighting specific features, invited multiple celebrities on board for the cast and for the soundtrack, and shared updates as part of the Night City Wire episodes. Cyberpunk was being sold not only by the gamers but also by the developers themselves as the greatest and most revolutionary video game of all time. So how do you do that? How do you make the perfect video game? Well, you can't. It's an ideal that's simply impossible to achieve, especially when you actively set out to do so. Trying to compete with the gamer's imagination and wildest dreams is foolish, because no matter what's inside the gamer's mind, it will always be greater than anything developers can realistically achieve, for now at least. And Cyberpunk 2077 was caught in all this. It was cursed, condemned by its very own ambition to never be able to meet audiences' expectations. And it's not the first game to be plagued with similar issues. No Man's Sky, Death Stranding, and The Last Guardian are probably some of the most famous examples of that, even though all of them were in hot waters for completely different reasons. But Cyberpunk's problem is much more complex. On one hand, you have the unrealistic expectations and the blind faith of the gamers, and on the other, you have a developer that might have gotten a bit too comfortable with the praise they've been receiving over the last couple of years, leading to an overconfident studio that may be aimed a bit too high. But then, above all that, you have the bugs and all the technical issues currently plaguing the last-gen consoles, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. But first, let's talk about the actual design of the game. So today we're going to dive deep into Cyberpunk 2077, see what it truly has to offer, look at its unhealthy relationship with hype, and how it's most likely been its worst enemy. Before trying to understand what happened with the Cyberpunk hype train, I think it's important that I give you my own personal thoughts on the game and tell you what my experience has been like so far. So I'm currently playing the PS5 version of the game, so technically it's PS4 via backwards compatibility. The game runs in 4K at a generally consistent 60 FPS and looks really freaking good most of the time. In about 30 hours of playtime, I've had like 8 crashes and only minor bugs and a few glitches. So my experience has been nothing like you've seen online over the last week or two. I understand that there are issues for sure, but I was lucky enough to encounter almost none of them. And so far, I think it's a great game. Different than what I expected, but still what's there is very well made and most importantly, extremely fun. Is it as groundbreaking as people thought it would be? Absolutely not. Some parts of it yes, but others not so much. First, I think it's safe to say that the game underwent a lot of changes during its years of development. The big and most important one, in my opinion, has to do with how CD Projekt Red themselves present the game. In the first ever gameplay trailer, Cyberpunk was showcased as a narrative-driven open-world RPG. Now, if you go on the official website, the game's presented as an open-world action-adventure story, which is a completely different genre of games. So if you were expecting a full-on RPG, you might be in for a disappointment. In Cyberpunk 2077, you play as V, a cyber-enhanced gun-for-hire looking for jobs in Night City, this huge, loud, and colorful metropolis. You have a main story path, but also plenty of side quests and contracts that will bring you in the seedy underbelly of the city or at the top of its most glamorous buildings. At first, the setting was supposed to be the backdrop for a role-playing experience filled with choices and consequences. And although the game does keep multiple RPG elements as its foundation, most of them are fairly straightforward. For instance, at the beginning of the game, you can choose your life path, which is basically your backstory. Unfortunately, aside from the opening prologue, a couple of dialogue options, and the ending, your life path doesn't really alter the course of the game, much like most of the encounters you'll have. Yes, your choices will have an impact on the story, but maybe not in the meaningful way people wanted. Apparently, only 2% of dialogues have an effect on how the story unfolds, and by far the quest that offers the most possibilities is the pickup, which is actually one of the first. Almost all of the quests do offer branching paths for you to choose the best possible approach depending on your build. Like for one of the missions, I needed to go inside a club's VIP section. I tried entering through the back door, but I wasn't strong enough, so I finally decided to use my hacking abilities to sneak past the bouncer instead. Although all those choices, whether they are gameplay or story related, are not nearly as deep as games like Fallout New Vegas, Mass Effect, or Alpha Protocol. I mean, not even close. Usually, the lack of substantial choices and consequences would have pissed me off in a game like that, especially after being told that every choice would matter. But thankfully, the story is so good that even if my decisions only slightly altered the course of the plot, it didn't ruin the game for me. Cyberpunk explores plenty of extremely fascinating but also very mature and surprisingly dark themes. It does so through an incredibly engaging investigation, full of mystery, well-written dialogues, and great characters. Even the side missions have captivating and thought-out stories, and almost every single piece of collectible you'll find has something of interest to read. But narrative isn't the only gameplay pillar featuring RPG elements. You have an incredibly exhaustive skill tree with individual perks that level up seamlessly as you play using particular playstyles. You have a loot system filled with stats and attributes, you can customize your character's body modifications, and so on. You can really create a build that fits your own personal style. You can go full on melee, stealth, heavy weapons, or even focus on hacking. I found all this very well made and fleshed out to an almost ridiculous degree. And the combat was much more fun than I expected. It's fast, brutal, super satisfying, and the sound effects are great, except for the fistfights, which are pretty bad. I know a lot of people didn't like the combat, but I did. Once again though, it's nothing you haven't seen before. You have the loot system of Borderlands, the seamless leveling up of Skyrim, and the body modifications of Human Revolution or Mankind Divided. But the game does present things in a way that feels revolutionary, when on paper there's nothing completely new. For instance, in almost every other AAA open world, like in most Ubisoft games, when you have to liberate an enemy outpost, it's just that, a point on the map that will most likely lead to battle. But Cyberpunk isn't like that. Despite some obvious shortcomings I'll talk about in a couple of seconds, Night City looks like a real place, meaning that almost everything you do in this game feels like you're interacting with a world and not with a video game. I'm not saying that it actually is, but that it feels like it. There's a big difference here. Take the side quests. Most of them are given to you through a phone call from the local fixer, and all of them have relatively fleshed out narratives or backstories that give context to what you're doing. And some of them will even ask you to bring back something like a piece of evidence, stolen gear, or whatever is the objective of the quest, to a physical drop point or even to someone, and that someone usually has an apartment or a workplace. Which does give the impression that the world is alive, that everything exists outside of the player's perspective, and that your actions truly matter when actually it's just an enemy outpost to clear out, and all of the phone calls, the text messages, and different drop-off points are just for show. And the game has a lot of these kinds of things. Pretty much everything has some kind of foundation in the game's world and lore. Whether it's the collectibles or these optional boss fights, everything has a story to distract you from the truth, which is that you've already played this, but still they do a damn good job at it. From a pure gameplay perspective, there's not much that's new or fresh here, but everything is competently made and nothing feels completely uninspired. But basically what they're doing is hiding a very effective but basic game behind their fascinating and masterfully crafted world. Which brings me to the world itself. Night City is by far the highlight of Cyberpunk. From a distance, this is the best city ever realized in a video game, without question. The architecture, the various districts, the overall density, the insane attention to detail, the soundscape, everything's there to make Night City come to life. Well, except a couple of things. Unfortunately, it's when you start interacting with the city that the illusion crumbles. NPCs are basically brain dead, the police system is completely broken at the moment, and very few interactions are possible, like drinking at the bar, grabbing some food, and things like that. Sadly, all these are relegated to specific scripted sequences. You know something's wrong when a 12-year-old game has a more interactive world and more believable NPCs. But still, Night City is generally a tremendous success, and I'm sure most of the issues I just listed will be fixed in the future. So if I were to give it a score, I would probably give it around an 8 or an 8.5, and it could even go above that with a few significant updates. And for any other game, that would have been totally fine. Without the hype and the expectations, and without the technical issues, of course, a game like this would have been received as one of the best action-adventure open world in recent memory. But for Cyberpunk 2077, that's not enough. That's where unrealistic expectations come into play. Looking at Reddit throughout the years made me realize that people were expecting something completely new that would literally change the face of gaming forever. And as I mentioned, Cyberpunk borrows quite a lot from other games, but that would not have been an issue if the expectations weren't so high and if people weren't expecting a complete revolution of the medium. The recent God of War is a perfect example of that. This game borrowed elements from Zelda, Metroid, and even The Last of Us, but since no one was expecting it to break the boundaries of gaming, those borrowed features didn't stick out like a sore thumb like they do in Cyberpunk. So where does this confusion come from? Well, I went back and watched all the footage CD Projekt released over the years, and well, the game changed a lot since then, especially when you look at the first gameplay reveal of 2018. Of course, a game can evolve over the years, and the mere fact that the actual genre seems to have changed within the last 2 years obviously hints at pretty significant differences under the hood. Because you see, from 2012 to 2018, the game was advertised as an RPG, and in 2019, it was suddenly an action-adventure story. What? Thankfully, as we got closer to launch, the trailers were a little bit more accurate and representative of the actual game, but they still showcased multiple missing features. But even then, the damage was already done. First impressions are everything, and a lot of things were said during that first gameplay reveal in 2018, things that would be engraved in the gamers' minds for the next 2 years. Let's look at a couple of them and see if they still stand. But there's also lots of other things that were not necessarily promised, but greatly suggested in the following trailers. Like customization. I mean, they released dedicated videos for the clothing styles, the guns, and the cars in this game, leading pretty much everyone to believe that we would be able to change everything about our character, which isn't the case. If you want to look like one of these monstrosities, literally turn your face into solid gold or get robot arms, you can't, because most of the body modifications and implants are only passive abilities that are not even cosmetics, which is a shame considering one of the biggest themes of the game is the loss of humanity through artificial augmentations. You also can't customize the cars you find, you can't buy houses, and the gun system revolves around a large amount of loot rather than true meaningful customization. Wall running was also removed, vehicle combat, and the list goes on. That's quite a lot of broken promises, but strangely enough, what was actually showed in the trailers isn't that far off from the actual game, but companies should know that the words you use and the way you present something have a significant impact on what gamers anticipate. For example, Ripper Docs. I don't know about you guys, but I was hoping to have these badass animations every time I would get an implant installed. But nope. This happens once, and for the rest of the game, it's just a menu. Same thing with eating and drinking. So what happened? What led to this massive misunderstanding between what the developers were actually doing behind the scenes and what the gamers were expecting? Well, first, I think that when a game based on a beloved tabletop RPG is being developed by the same studio behind one of the most acclaimed action RPG ever, gamers immediately start to dream. Especially when the developers start saying things like most believable open world to date, or every choices will have consequences and will affect the world around you, and things like that. And as you know, once the hype train is in full motion, it's impossible to stop. Cyberpunk basically became a vessel for the wishes of gamers around the world, and the longer the game was delayed, the faster the vessel was filling up with hopes and sometimes unreasonable demands. But who should get the blame for such a mess? The internet or CD Projekt Red themselves? The answer is mainly the developers, but also a bit of both. The online discussion surrounding Cyberpunk was simply unhealthy and led to an unparalleled level of hype that was destined to disappoint. Reddit and various online forums overhyped this game to death and sold the idea to everyone that this was going to be the greatest game ever created. And everyone kind of fell for it. I sure did. And as much as I really like the final product, it's not a revolution at all, except for the world, which does hold the potential to be revolutionary. But even then, the biggest contributor to this hype catastrophe was obviously the way the developers handled their communications. I do believe that CD Projekt Red made multiple mistakes that only participated to the insane level of anticipation. First off, the game was announced way too early into development, and because of the multiple delays and the years of waiting, the game achieved this sort of mythic status almost like Half-Life 3. And no matter how good the game is, it just cannot compete with years and years of daydreaming from gamers. Announcing a game so early also means that it is subject to change, leading to instances where some people might get hyped about things that will not be in the final game. And here, everyone was expecting a crazy detailed RPG with a world so interactive that you could get lost in it for hours without doing anything, and that's not what we have here. Instead, we have a very solid action-adventure game with some RPG elements and a super impressive open world that unfortunately isn't as alive as we hoped it would. Although this is not as bad as No Man's Sky in my opinion, and even if Cyberpunk does have multiple missing features, CD Projekt Red did announce most of those changes prior to the game's release. And as the game was getting closer to launch, they did start to drop the RPG label in favor of open world action-adventure story. Maybe they should have made a special announcement of some sort to prevent any confusion and let the gamers know exactly what they were paying for, which wasn't an RPG. Now let's talk about the bugs and the technical issues. What a mess. Basically, at the moment, the game is either extremely buggy for many PC and next-gen console players, or practically unplayable for last-gen console owners. Drops to 15 FPS at 720p is just unacceptable. That being said, I know a lot of you won't like to hear this, but I think that another big mistake that CD Projekt Red made is the fact that they decided to release the game on last-gen consoles. Now, I know the game was first announced when PS4 and Xbox One were current gen, and that since it actually released on those consoles, it should run decently, and I completely agree with this. But as soon as they saw that their vision would have to be severely compromised on these consoles, they should have simply dropped it. Much like The Last Guardian, a game that was supposed to be on the PlayStation 3 but that ultimately transitioned to PS4 after years of delay. Trying to make an open world game that looks as good as this work on 8-year-old hardware isn't the easiest task. In fact, it's impossible, and I don't even think that they should have attempted to do so. I've seen lots of people mentioning that base PS4 runs The Last of Us 2 or Red Dead Redemption 2, so why not Cyberpunk? But both of these games have worlds that are not nearly as complex and intricate as Night City. Trying to make this game run on old hardware only prevented the developers from fully dedicating themselves to making the best game possible. It's a task that most likely absorbed a lot of development time that maybe should have been invested someplace else. Which leads us to the final question we all have in mind. The game has been delayed numerous times already, why not delay it once more? Well, this brings me to the last mistake the developers made. They should have been more transparent about the time needed to finish the game properly instead of just constantly push back the release date. It's quite clear that they severely underestimated the time it would take to develop this game, and because of that, they dug themselves into a hole by announcing the game too early. As the years went by, the wait for Cyberpunk was simply getting ridiculous, and I'm sure the investors and the management board behind one of the most expensive video game of all time would say the same. They just had to release the game in whatever state that was. And since then, CD Projekt Red did apologize for this disaster of a release and for hiding how bad the last-gen versions were. If you want to know more about that whole situation, they released to the public a recent conference call they've had with their management board. Fascinating, but also very sad stuff. You can find the links below. I'm sure things will be fixed eventually, and I urge you to play this game when it finally reaches a better state. Put your expectations on the side and try to enjoy it for what it is and not for what it could have been. I know it sucks, but it is what it is. No, it's not the revolution people expected, but it's a great game that will absolutely land in my top of the year list. But this whole thing should also serve as a lesson for the gaming community. We have to stop overhyping stuff to this extreme level. I love being hyped about games. I mean, I did 2 wishlist videos for Hogwarts Legacy, but we have to stay realistic in our expectations and remind ourselves that human beings are making these games and that there's a certain limit to what's possible. But developers should also learn to keep a low profile and stop announcing games too early. It just leads to unreasonable expectations, because it's always better to be pleasantly surprised by a game than be severely disappointed by it. Thank you guys for watching my video on Cyberpunk. What a disaster of a release. I've never seen something like this. I thought No Man's Sky was being torn apart, but that's nothing compared to what we're seeing here. I'm very curious to know who among you guys have been playing it and what are your thoughts so far. If you want to share those in more details, I invite you to join the From the Attic Discord server. The invite link is in the description. I kinda want to make another video on Night City itself though, because I do believe there's a lot of great potential in that world. I also want to stay away from the overwhelming negativity happening online at the moment and try to find light in all that darkness. That being said, thanks for watching and I'll talk to you guys later.